Let's begin with a simple but profound truth. Your brain is designed for consistency, and yet most of us struggle with it. We start something new with enthusiasm, a workout plan, a project, a learning goal, and days or weeks later we find ourselves off track. Why does this happen, and more importantly, how can we fix it? Today, we'll explore the neuroscience of consistency and, more importantly, how to force yourself intelligently and sustainably to be consistent in the areas that matter most. Consistency is a function of brain wiring, not just willpower. To understand this, we need to look at how the human brain is designed to form, repeat, and sustain behaviors. At the center of this process is the brain's complex network of neural circuits, especially the prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia, and dopaminergic pathways. These structures don't operate based on motivation alone. Instead, they rely on repeated activation and strengthening of specific patterns, much like carving grooves in a path by walking the same trail again and again. The idea that some people are just naturally consistent is misleading. While individual differences exist, the brain's architecture is universally malleable. This concept is known as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change its structure and function in response to experience. When a behavior is repeated, the neurons responsible for that action become more efficient at firing together. Over time, what once felt difficult becomes automated. This is why consistency becomes easier the longer you stick with something, not because of a mysterious boost in motivation, but because your neural pathways become more efficient at executing that action with less cognitive resistance. The prefrontal cortex, located right behind the forehead, plays a central role in this process. It is responsible for goal-directed behavior, planning, and impulse control. However, it is also one of the most easily fatigued areas of the brain. This means that willpower, our ability to resist temptations and stay focused, is inherently limited. Research has shown that under stress, fatigue, or emotional strain, the prefrontal cortex becomes less effective, and our brain tends to revert to older, more deeply wired behaviors stored in the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is where habits live. It's a more primitive structure, but incredibly efficient. When we repeat a behavior often enough, the control over that behavior shifts from the effortful prefrontal cortex to the automatic basal ganglia. That transition is what real consistency looks like, not a daily struggle of willpower, but an effortless execution of well-rehearsed routines. Understanding dopamine's role in this equation is also critical. Dopamine is not just the pleasure molecule, it's the molecule of anticipation and motivation. When you start a new habit, your brain rewards you with dopamine, giving you a spike of energy and focus. But that spike doesn't last. Novelty fades, and with it, dopamine levels drop. This is where many people fall off track, believing they've lost interest or motivation. In truth, they're experiencing the natural decline in dopamine that occurs when an activity shifts from novel to routine. The key to staying consistent is not to chase dopamine, but to recognize that long-term consistency is about building stable neural circuits that operate independently of fluctuating neurochemicals. To reinforce this wiring, the brain responds exceptionally well to immediate rewards and feedback. This is why breaking down large goals into small, achievable tasks is effective. Every time you complete a small task and register a win, crossing it off a list, seeing a visual tracker move you reinforce the neural pathways associated with that behavior. The brain loves closure, and every time you close a loop, dopamine is released, albeit in smaller amounts. These micro-rewards help bridge the gap between effort and automation. Another critical factor is environment. Your external environment can serve as a cue to trigger specific neural patterns. For example, if you always sit in the same spot to write or exercise at the same time each day, your brain begins to associate those cues with that behavior. Over time, the environmental trigger activates the behavior almost reflexively. This is a process rooted in classical conditioning, but it's supported by what we know about how synaptic pathways strengthen through association and repetition. Crucially, the process of becoming consistent is not linear. There will be setbacks, but every time you return to the behavior, even after a lapse, you strengthen the long-term pattern. In neuroscience, this is known as long-term potentiation. The more a synapse fires, the more likely it is to fire again in the future. In other words, every repetition matters. It's not about perfection, but about persistence. The brain does not demand flawless consistency. It demands enough repetition to make the action feel familiar. When we understand consistency through the lens of brain wiring, it becomes less about personal weakness and more about practical strategy. If you structure your day to support the formation of positive neural loops, reduce the cognitive load on your prefrontal cortex, and deliberately use triggers and feedback, you can build consistency in any area of life. Not because you feel like it, but because you've trained your brain to make that behavior the default mode. Relying on systems rather than motivation is a fundamental shift in how we approach behavior change, and it's supported by neuroscience and behavioral psychology. Motivation, while powerful in the short term, is highly volatile. It fluctuates based on mood, energy levels, sleep, environment, and even blood sugar. That means if your ability to act is based on whether or not you feel motivated, your consistency will always be fragile. The brain, however, thrives on predictability and automation. It does not require motivation to execute a habit once that habit has been encoded deeply enough. What it does require is a structured system, a reliable process that cues the behavior, reduces friction, and rewards repetition. Systems are externalized mechanisms that guide behavior independent of mood or internal drive. This could be as simple as a fixed morning routine, a pre-scheduled work session, or a checklist of daily tasks. These systems remove decision fatigue, which is the mental exhaustion that results from making too many choices. When you're relying on motivation, you're constantly deciding, should I do this now? Should I wait? Should I skip it? Each decision adds friction. A system eliminates the need for repeated choices. You don't have to wonder whether to go for a run. You've already decided you'll run at 7:00 a.m. every weekday, and your running shoes are already placed by the door. Habit stacking is one such system. It's based on the concept of neural anchoring, where you tie a new behavior to an already established one. If you brush your teeth every morning and you want to start journaling, you can stack journaling right after brushing. The existing habit becomes a neural cue for the new one. Over time, the brain begins to associate one with the other, and the sequence becomes automatic. This works because the brain excels at pattern recognition and routine formation. Once patterns are identified and repeated often enough, they are transferred from conscious effort to subconscious execution, primarily within the basal ganglia. Feedback loops are another crucial component of effective systems. The brain is wired to seek feedback. It wants to know if an action led to a result. When you complete a task and see immediate feedback, whether it's a checkmark, a visual progress tracker, or even a sense of accomplishment, dopamine is released. This reward reinforces the behavior and increases the likelihood that you'll repeat it. Without feedback, even consistent effort can feel empty and motivation deteriorates. Systems that include built-in feedback mechanisms tap into the reward system of the brain, creating a sustainable loop of effort and reward that operates regardless of how motivated you feel on a given day. Environment also functions as part of a behavioral system. The cues and triggers embedded in your surroundings influence your actions more than most people realize. If your phone is on your desk, you'll check it. If your workspace is cluttered, your focus will suffer. But if you engineer your environment to support a specific behavior, keeping distractions out of sight, preparing your materials in advance, maintaining physical spaces associated with certain tasks, your brain will begin to associate those environmental signals with the corresponding behavior. This reduces the cognitive load required to initiate the action and increases the probability of consistency. Another system-based strategy is time blocking, where specific windows of time are dedicated to specific tasks. When the brain anticipates a certain activity at a certain time, it begins to prepare for it neurologically. Cognitive resources are more efficiently allocated and resistance is lowered. Over time, the timing becomes a form of procedural memory, like muscle memory, for the brain. This approach also builds rhythm into your day, which is aligned with the brain's natural circadian rhythms. When a system respects your biological highs and lows, consistency becomes far more attainable. It's also important to remember that a system is only effective if it's frictionless. That means making the desired behavior easier to do and the undesired behavior harder. If you want to read more, keep a book by your bed. If you want to stop scrolling social media, remove the apps from your home screen. The brain will always take the path of least resistance. So the key is to design systems that lower the resistance to positive behaviors and raise the resistance to negative ones. In this way, systems do not rely on your emotional state. They bypass it. Motivation is temporary and unreliable. Systems are stable and teach your brain what to expect and when. Over time, systems create consistency because they convert intentional action into automatic execution. When you stop waiting to feel like it and start following a system, you allow your brain to do what it does best: identify patterns, build routines, and hardwire efficiency. Systems are not about being rigid, they are about being strategic with how your brain naturally operates. Discipline is not a personality trait or a natural gift. It's a practice that becomes stronger through deliberate repetition, especially when it's uncomfortable. The brain is biologically wired to avoid discomfort and conserve energy. This is an evolutionary survival mechanism. When we encounter resistance, whether physical, mental, or emotional, the brain interprets it as a potential threat and activates circuits designed to pull us back into a zone of safety. This is why the first reaction to discomfort is usually procrastination, avoidance, or rationalization, but this very moment of resistance is the precise window where discipline is built. It's not in the times when things are easy or when we feel good about doing the work. It's in the moments when every part of you wants to stop, and you keep going anyway. When we choose to act in those moments of resistance, we are not only executing a behavior, we are teaching our brain a new rule. The neural pathways responsible for self-regulation and executive function, primarily located in the prefrontal cortex, begin to strengthen. This part of the brain governs planning, focus, decision making, and impulse control. The more we engage it under pressure, the more resilient and efficient it becomes. Like a muscle, it adapts to the load placed upon it. If you avoid stress and discomfort, the prefrontal cortex doesn't get challenged, and its ability to maintain focus and override impulsive reactions remains weak. But if you repeatedly place yourself in situations where discomfort is present and continue to follow through, those same circuits become more robust and accessible in future scenarios. This is not just about forcing yourself to work longer hours or pushing through fatigue. It's about building the habit of showing up even when your emotional state tells you not to. Emotional friction is one of the biggest barriers to consistency, but discipline is what enables you to move forward in spite of it. Neurochemically, every time you override the desire to quit, you are modulating levels of dopamine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. Dopamine, in particular, plays a unique role here. It is not only released when you receive a reward, but also when you pursue a goal, especially in the face of adversity. This means that the very act of persisting under pressure creates a reward loop in the brain. Over time, your brain starts to associate difficult action with a form of internal satisfaction, which makes it easier to face similar resistance in the future. Moreover, discipline developed under pressure increases something called frustration tolerance. This is the ability to keep functioning when things aren't going your way, when the outcome is uncertain, when progress is slow, or when setbacks occur. The brain, when repeatedly exposed to low, reward or high effort conditions, gradually recalibrates its threshold for discomfort. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes emotional conflict and error detection, becomes more attuned to distinguishing between actual danger and temporary unease. As a result, you become less reactive to discomfort, more grounded in action, and less controlled by temporary feelings. Repetition under pressure also impacts your sense of identity. The brain constantly updates its internal model of self based on the behaviors you repeat. If you consistently act in alignment with your goals, especially when it's hard, your brain begins to internalize the idea, "I am the type of person who follows through." This is not just psychological, it's neurological. The medial prefrontal cortex, involved in self-referential thinking, encodes those repeated actions into your self-concept. This change in identity further reinforces discipline because now your actions are no longer isolated events. They are evidence of who you are becoming. Importantly, pressure doesn't have to be dramatic or extreme. Even small acts of follow-through, done daily under minor resistance, begin to rewire the brain. Waking up when your alarm rings instead of hitting snooze, completing a workout even when you're tired, or finishing a task before relaxing. These are all micro moments of discipline. And because the brain responds to frequency more than intensity, it's these small, repeated efforts under pressure that create lasting neural change. When you consistently push through resistance, you start to trust yourself. This internal trust becomes a resource the brain taps into during future challenges. Instead of wondering whether you'll have the strength to do it, your brain already knows you've done it before. This reduces hesitation, lowers cognitive friction, and creates a smoother path to action. Over time, discipline becomes your default, not because life got easier, but because your brain got stronger at navigating difficulty. The nervous system plays a central role in how we experience and respond to the world around us, especially when it comes to building consistent habits. At the core of our ability to show up every day, even when we don't feel like it, is the state of our nervous system. It governs how we regulate stress, process uncertainty, and adapt to change. When your nervous system is dysregulated, either hyper-aroused and anxious or hypo-aroused and fatigued, your ability to follow through with intentional behaviors drops dramatically. That's because the brain and body shift into survival mode, prioritizing short-term safety and comfort over long-term goals. In this state, consistency becomes nearly impossible because your attention is hijacked by internal noise and threat signals. Training your nervous system to handle pressure without collapsing into chaos or avoidance is therefore one of the most powerful ways to enhance consistency. This doesn't happen through willpower alone. It happens through intentional exposure and recalibration. One of the most effective tools for this is breath control. Breathing is one of the few bodily functions that is both automatic and voluntary, and it serves as a direct lever to influence your autonomic nervous system. Slow, controlled exhales activate the parasympathetic branch, the system responsible for rest, recovery, and composure. When you extend your exhale longer than your inhale, you signal to the brain that you are safe, even if your environment is stressful. This subtle signal reduces cortisol levels, lowers heart rate, and restores clarity. Doing this repeatedly, especially in high-pressure moments, trains the brain to remain calm under fire. Another way to train the nervous system is through deliberate cold exposure. This could be a cold shower, ice bath, or exposure to cold air. When you step into cold discomfort willingly, your body initiates a strong stress response. Your heart rate spikes, adrenaline is released, and your breath becomes shallow. But if you stay in the experience and consciously control your breathing, you begin to teach your nervous system how to remain composed in chaos. The brain learns that stress does not always require withdrawal or panic. It can be tolerated, managed, and even used as a performance enhancer. This experience of self-regulated stress builds what neuroscientists call stress resilience, which means your threshold for distraction and discomfort increases over time. As your resilience grows, you become less thrown off by life's unpredictable variables and more able to stick with your routines regardless of how you feel. Even posture has a role in nervous system regulation. Your body's position sends constant feedback to your brain. A hunched, collapsed posture signals threat and defeat. An upright, open posture with shoulders back and chest elevated sends signals of confidence and control. This is not just psychological, it's physiological. The vagus nerve, a key player in parasympathetic activity, is more effectively engaged when the diaphragm is free to move, which only happens when the spine is upright. This feedback loop between body and brain shapes your internal state and influences whether you approach your daily tasks with energy or apathy. Small changes in posture maintained consistently can recalibrate how your nervous system reacts to the demands of the day. Sleep is another foundational layer of nervous system training. When you're sleep deprived, your amygdala, the part of the brain involved in fear and emotional reactivity, becomes hyperactive, while your prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and planning, becomes impaired. This combination makes it far more difficult to maintain composure, resist distraction, or stay on track with your habits. Consistency is not just about pushing harder, it's about restoring your biological capacity to meet your goals. By protecting sleep quality through regular sleep and wake times, limited evening screen exposure, and reduced caffeine intake, you help your nervous system enter the day with greater balance and readiness. Physical movement also directly affects how your nervous system performs. Regular, moderate, intensity exercise increases levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor BDNF, which supports neural plasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt. It also boosts dopamine and serotonin, neurotransmitters linked to motivation and mood. But beyond these chemical benefits, exercise is itself a form of structured stress that mimics real-life challenge. It teaches the nervous system to elevate under pressure, then recover. This cycle of stress and recovery, when practiced intentionally, builds a more flexible and adaptive nervous system. Over time, that means fewer mood swings, better energy regulation, and more reliable access to focused effort, even when conditions are not ideal. By regularly exposing your nervous system to manageable stress, followed by intentional recovery, you create a new baseline. That baseline becomes your emotional and physiological foundation for consistency. It's not about eliminating stress or discomfort. It's about developing the internal capacity to face them without losing your rhythm. The more you train your nervous system to stay grounded in challenge, the more consistently you can act, because you're no longer operating from reactivity but from resilience. In essence, forcing yourself to be consistent is less about relying on fleeting motivation and more about understanding and harnessing the underlying biology of your brain and body. It involves training your brain to push through discomfort, building discipline under pressure, and strengthening your nervous system's ability to manage stress and uncertainty. By intentionally embracing resistance, regulating your internal state, and committing to small daily actions even when it's difficult, you create powerful neural patterns and an identity rooted in follow-through. Consistency becomes not just a habit, but a way of being, a steady force that drives you toward your goals regardless of circumstances. This is how lasting change is made and how your potential truly unfolds over time.